It all started, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. Not just any piece of paper, mind you, but one of those crisp, official-looking envelopes that spells trouble before you even slice it open. My name and address were typed with a sort of cold precision that made my stomach clench. This was from the Homeowners Association, the dreaded HOA, a body I'd mostly managed to ignore during my 5 peaceful years in this quiet, leafy suburb. I had a small, well-tended garden, a patch of green that was my pride and joy, my escape from the daily grind of software development. And nestled amongst my prize-winning roses and carefully cultivated hostas were my gnomes. Not an army, not then. Just a whimsical collection of about 15 little fellows, a fisherman by the birdbath, a scholar reading under a miniature bonsai, a cheerful chap waving from beneath a fern. They were charming, a bit quirky, and utterly harmless. Or so I thought. The letter, once liberated from its stern casing, informed me in no uncertain terms that I was in violation of Bylaw 7, subsection C, paragraph 2. Excessive or unapproved yard ornamentation. My gnomes, apparently, fell into this nefarious category. The fine? A cool $500. $500 for a handful of ceramic figures bringing a little joy to my corner of the world. I read it twice, then a third time, a slow burn starting in my chest. This wasn't just a fine. It was an insult. It was busybody bureaucracy at its finest, a power trip disguised as community standards. My first instinct was to laugh. Surely, this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. I pictured the HOA board, a shadowy cabal of curtain twitchers and retired colonels, poring over grainy photos of my gnomes, debating their aesthetic merit with the gravity of Supreme Court justices. But the $500 figure wasn't funny. That was a significant chunk of change, enough to make me sit up and take notice. My garden was my sanctuary, and the gnomes were part of its soul. They weren't garish plastic flamingos or rusty car parts on cinder blocks. They were tasteful, carefully chosen, and frankly, none of the HOA's business as long as my property was neat and tidy, which it always was. I'd always been a live and let live kind of guy, but this felt personal. This felt like an attack on my little slice of happiness. The letter mentioned a new HOA president, a Mrs. Eleanor Periwinkle, who had apparently taken office with the zeal of a revolutionary, determined to whip the neighborhood into pristine, soulless conformity. I'd heard whispers, vague grumblings from other neighbors about new restrictions on paint colors and basketball hoops, but I'd dismissed them. Not my circus, not my monkeys. Until now, it seemed, the monkeys had arrived at my doorstep, waving a hefty bill. That evening, instead of enjoying the sunset with a cool drink in my garden, I found myself pacing my living room, the offending letter crumpled in my fist. The injustice of it gnawed at me. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the principle. Who were they to dictate what harmless little figures I could place in my own yard, on my own property? The sheer audacity of it. I decided I wouldn't take this lying down. I'd appeal, I'd reason with them. I'd show them the error of their ways. Little did I know, I was about to step onto a battlefield I hadn't chosen, against an opponent far more stubborn and petty than I could have ever imagined. The age of gnome diplomacy was about to begin, and if that failed, well, I was starting to feel a certain kinship with those little bearded rebels in my garden. This was war by any other name, and they had just fired the first very expensive shot. My initial attempts at diplomacy were, to put it mildly, a complete and utter failure. I drafted a polite, carefully worded email to the HOA board, explaining that my gnomes were cherished personal items, not excessive ornamentation, and that I believed the fine was a misapplication of a vague rule. I even attached a few charming photos of the gnomes in their natural habitat, hoping to appeal to some hidden sense of whimsy. The response, when it finally came a week later, was a masterclass in bureaucratic stonewalling. It was signed by Mrs. Periwinkle herself, and it basically reiterated the original letter, adding a condescending little paragraph about maintaining community aesthetic standards and property values. There was no room for discussion, no hint of compromise. Pay the fine, remove the offending gnomes, or face further action. My blood pressure, which normally idled around calm tech guy, spiked. I tried calling the HOA office. After navigating an automated menu that seemed designed by Kafka, I finally got a human being on the line, a bored-sounding administrator who clearly had a script for dealing with disgruntled residents. She informed me that Mrs. Periwinkle was unavailable, but would take my concerns under advisement, which, as we all know, is code for "your complaint is now officially in the circular file." I even considered attending the next HOA meeting, a prospect I usually avoided like the plague. These meetings were legendary for their tediousness and the bickering that often erupted over the placement of recycling bins or the precise shade of beige one was allowed to paint their mailbox. But $500 was $500, and the principle of the thing was starting to feel like a very large, very pointy gnome hat pressing down on me. Before the meeting, I did a bit of recon. I talked to a few neighbors. Old Mr. Henderson, who'd lived here for 40 years, grumbled about Mrs. Periwinkle being a tyrant in a pantsuit. Sarah, from across the street, a young mom, sighed about a warning she'd received for her kids' chalk art on their own driveway. It seemed I wasn't the only one feeling the sting of the new regime. This wasn't just about my gnomes anymore. It was about a broader pattern of overreach. The day of the HOA meeting arrived. I put on a collared shirt, armed myself with my polite arguments and a printout of my email exchange, and walked into the community clubhouse, a room usually reserved for bridge club and uninspired potlucks. Mrs. Periwinkle was exactly as I'd imagined. A woman with a tightly permed helmet of hair, a ramrod posture, and eyes that could curdle milk from 50 paces. She presided over the meeting like a hanging judge, tapping her pen impatiently as residents aired their grievances. When my turn came, I laid out my case calmly and rationally. I spoke about the joy my gnomes brought me, the harmlessness of their presence, the vagueness of the rule. I even tried a little humor, which fell flatter than a gnome who'd had a run-in with a lawnmower. Mrs. Periwinkle listened with an expression of polite disinterest, her lips pursed. When I finished, she didn't address my points. Instead, she launched into a lecture about the importance of uniformity, the dangers of creeping individualism, and how one person's charming gnome could be another's tacky eyesore. She made it sound as if my 15 ceramic figures were single-handedly dragging down the property values of the entire subdivision. She even had the gall to suggest that my gnomes might be frightening to small children. A claim so absurd I almost laughed out loud. The board, a collection of nodding sycophants, murmured their agreement. My appeal was summarily denied. The fine stood. I was instructed to remove the gnomes within 7 days or face an additional daily penalty. I walked out of that meeting, not just angry, but with a cold, hard knot of determination forming in my gut. They wanted a fight. They had no idea. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was about freedom of expression, however small and ceramic. This was about pushing back against petty tyranny. As I walked home, the setting sun casting long shadows, my gaze fell upon the vacant lot next to my property. It was a scraggly, overgrown patch of land, owned by some out-of-state investment company that had clearly forgotten about it. It had been for sale for years, the sign faded and tilting. And that's when the idea, a glorious, ridiculous, and utterly defiant idea, began to sprout. If they wouldn't let me have my gnomes on my property, well then, maybe I just needed more property. Property beyond their grasping, rule-obsessed little hands. The seed had been planted, not in my garden, but in the fertile ground of my indignation. The idea, once it took root, grew with alarming speed. The empty lot, it was perfect. A blank canvas. A potential sanctuary for gnomes far beyond the reach of Mrs. Periwinkle and her joy-squashing bylaws. But could it work? The first thing I did was dive into the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS, that dreaded document that governed our lives. I read it cover to cover, then reread the sections on property jurisdiction. As far as I could tell, the HOA's authority was strictly limited to the properties within the designated subdivision plot. The adjacent lot, while bordering my own, was technically outside that plotted area. It was a separate parcel with its own tax ID, not part of the development our HOA governed. This was crucial. If I owned that lot, it would be my private kingdom, subject to city and county ordinances, of course, but not the whims of Mrs. Periwinkle's aesthetic police. A tiny flicker of malicious glee sparked within me. The thought of her face when she realized she couldn't touch my gnomes on that land was almost intoxicating. I spent the next few days in a whirlwind of due diligence. I looked up the county assessor's records online, confirming the lot's boundaries and its status as a separate entity. I checked local zoning laws. It was zoned residential, just like my own property, so there were no immediate red flags there regarding unusual usage, as long as I wasn't building a hazardous waste dump or a 20-story Gnome-shaped skyscraper. My gnomes, I figured, would be considered landscaping or yard art, well within permissible limits for a residential zone, especially if it wasn't governed by an HOA's more stringent and often arbitrary rules. I even had a discreet, hypothetical chat with a friend of a friend who was a real estate lawyer. Without giving away my master plan, I asked about the general principles of HOA jurisdiction over adjacent, separately owned properties. He confirmed my initial understanding. If it wasn't part of the platted subdivision covered by the HOA agreement, they generally had no say. Generally was the operative word, and he cautioned about potential nuisance claims, but for simple yard decorations on privately owned land outside their purview, their power was likely nil. The challenge, of course, was the cost. Buying a piece of land, even an overgrown, unwanted one, wasn't cheap. I had savings, carefully squirreled away for a rainy day or a major home improvement project. This, I reasoned, was both. It was raining HOA fines, and this was a major improvement to my quality of life and a declaration of independence. I crunched the numbers. It would be a stretch, but doable. I thought about the $500 fine now paid under duress and the principle of the matter. This wasn't just about defiance anymore. It was an investment in my peace of mind and perhaps a source of considerable long-term entertainment. The for sale sign on the lot was ancient, the contact number barely legible. I managed to track down the listing agent, a rather surprised-sounding fellow named Gary, who seemed to have forgotten he even had this particular property on his books. "Oh, that old thing," he'd said. "Yeah, the owners are keen to offload it. Been on the market for ages. You interested?" Interested? I was practically salivating. We arranged for me to view the lot, which basically involved me standing on my side of the property line and him standing on the other, swatting away mosquitoes. It was about 1/4 of an acre, mostly weeds, a few scrawny trees, and a general air of neglect. To Gary, it was a liability. To me, it was the future site of Fortress Gnomerigan. I made an offer, a lowball one to start, expecting some back and forth. To my astonishment, after a brief consultation with the faceless investment company, Gary called back the next day. "They accepted," he said, sounding almost as surprised as I was. "They just want it gone. Cash offer. Quick close." "You bet," I replied, trying to keep the triumph out of my voice. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, inspections, mostly to confirm there wasn't an unexploded bomb or a toxic waste spill under the weeds, and nervous waiting. I kept the whole thing under wraps. I didn't want Mrs. Periwinkle getting wind of it and trying some last-minute legal shenanigans, however unlikely. The thought of her finding out only after the ink was dry on the deed was a powerful motivator. Finally, the closing day arrived. I sat in a sterile title company office, signing my name on what felt like a mountain of documents. Handing over that cashier's check was a sobering moment, but the thrill of what I was about to accomplish far outweighed the financial sting. And then it was done. The keys, metaphorically speaking, as it was just land, were mine. I walked out of that office clutching the paperwork, a newly minted landowner. The lot next door, my future Gnome sanctuary, was officially mine. Phase 1 of Operation Gnome Freedom was complete. As I drove home, a wide grin stretched across my face. "Mrs. Periwinkle, you have no idea what's coming." The quiet suburban arms race had just escalated, and I was bringing gnomes. Lots and lots of gnomes. The first order of business, now that I was the proud owner of Lot 7B, as it was officially known, was to survey my new domain. I spent a Saturday morning wading through the knee-high grass and tangled vines, a machete in one hand. Okay. It was more like a pair of sturdy garden loppers, and a head full of glorious, Gnome-centric plans. The lot was roughly rectangular, sloping gently away from my existing property line. It had a few mature, albeit neglected, trees that would provide excellent shade and character for future gnome encampments. The sheer potential of it was exhilarating. It was a blank slate, waiting for the touch of a master gnome tactician. Or, just a guy who really, really liked gnomes and really, really disliked his HOA president. My original 15 gnomes, currently languishing in a box in my garage after the HOA's ultimatum, I'd grudgingly remove them from my yard to avoid further fines while the lot purchase was pending. We're about to get a lot of company. This wasn't going to be just a handful of gnomes. Oh no, this was going to be an army, a legion, a veritable gnome-apocalypse for anyone with an aversion to pointy red hats and benevolent bearded expressions. My planning sessions became the stuff of legend, at least in my own head. I spread out a rough sketch of Lot 7B on my kitchen table, marking potential zones. There would be the Fishing Gnomes Creek, a dry creek bed I planned to create with river stones, the Philosopher Gnome's Grove under the largest oak tree, the Mining Gnome's Quarry near a rocky outcrop, and, of course, a sunbathing beach for the more hedonistic members of the ceramic community, perhaps with a small sandbox and some tiny cocktail umbrellas. The centerpiece, I decided, would be a gnome henge, a miniature stone circle that would serve as their spiritual and ceremonial gathering place. The logistics of acquiring such a vast number of gnomes were considerable. My initial 15 suddenly seemed like a tiny scouting party. I needed reinforcements and lots of them. My evenings were now dedicated to online gnome reconnaissance. I scoured eBay, Etsy, Amazon, and countless obscure garden supply websites. I discovered a whole world of gnome diversity I never knew existed. Biker gnomes, zombie gnomes, ninja gnomes, even gnomes in kilts. My search history probably put me on several watch lists, but I was a man on a mission. I started placing orders. Small orders at first, then larger ones as I got bolder. Boxes started arriving at my doorstep with increasing frequency. The FedEx guy, a cheerful fellow named Dave, began to give me curious looks. "Big garden party, huh?" he asked one day, hefting a particularly large box that clinked suspiciously. "Something like that," I replied with a mysterious smile. My garage slowly transformed into a gnome staging area. They were everywhere, lined up on shelves, clustered in corners, peeking out from behind paint cans and old bicycles. I had gnomes of all shapes, sizes, and occupations. There were gnomes with fishing rods, gnomes with lanterns, gnomes with musical instruments, gnomes pushing wheelbarrows, gnomes holding tiny welcome signs, though the welcome wasn't intended for Mrs. Periwinkle. I even found a magnificent 7-foot-tall inflatable gnome, which I earmarked for a particularly prominent position. I became a connoisseur of gnome quality. I learned to distinguish between cheap, mass-produced plastic gnomes and the more robust, characterful resin or ceramic varieties. I favored the latter for durability and aesthetic appeal, though I wasn't above supplementing the ranks with some of the more amusing plastic ones, especially if they had a particularly defiant expression. I also started haunting local garden centers, flea markets, and antique shops. Sometimes I'd find a real gem, a vintage gnome with a story etched into its faded paint, or a quirky, handmade one with a unique personality. My collection was growing exponentially, from 15 to 50, then 100, then 200. My target number was ambitious, at least 500, one for every dollar of that wretched fine. And then maybe a few more just for good measure. I had to be careful, of course. I didn't want the HOA, particularly Mrs. Periwinkle, to get wind of my grand scheme prematurely. I timed the deliveries for when I was home, whisking the boxes into the garage before any nosy neighbors could get too curious. The lot itself remained untouched for now, a sleeping giant covered in weeds. The element of surprise was key. This wasn't just about placing gnomes. It was about making a statement, a sudden, overwhelming, undeniably gnomish statement. My wife, bless her patient soul, oscillated between amusement and mild concern. "Are you sure about this, honey?" she asked one evening, navigating a phalanx of gnomes that had temporarily taken over the spare bedroom. "It seems a little extreme." "Extreme situations call for extreme gnomes," I declared, holding up a particularly fierce-looking gnome warrior, complete with a tiny battle axe. She just shook her head and smiled, But I knew she was secretly enjoying the absurdity of it all, and she despised Mrs. Periwinkle almost as much as I did. The gnome acquisition phase was exhilarating. It was like planning a very small, very quiet, very ceramic invasion. Every new arrival felt like a small victory, another soldier reporting for duty. The financial outlay was significant, no doubt about it, but every time I thought of Mrs. Periwinkle's smug face at that HOA meeting, I'd click Add to Cart with renewed determination. Soon, very soon, Lot 7B would awaken, and the neighborhood would never be the same. The day of the Great Gnome Deployment, or G-Day, as I'd started calling it in my head, dawned bright and clear. I'd spent the previous weekend doing some preliminary work on Lot 7B. Not a full landscaping overhaul. I wanted to maintain a certain rustic, gnomes in the wild aesthetic, but I cleared some of the more aggressive weeds, trimmed a few low-hanging branches, and strategically placed some large rocks and logs to create interesting topographical features for my ceramic citizens. I'd also laid out a meandering path using simple stepping stones, allowing for optimal viewing of the upcoming gnome exhibits. My garage was now overflowing. Hundreds of gnomes, in all their varied glory, stood ready, their painted smiles seeming to gleam with anticipation. I enlisted the help of my teenage nephew, Tom, a good kid who thought the whole idea was epic and was happy to work for pizza and the sheer rebellious joy of it. Our mission was to transport and deploy the first wave, approximately 200 gnomes, onto Lot 7B, under the cover of a relatively quiet weekday morning when most neighbors, including, I hoped, Mrs. Periwinkle, would be at work or otherwise occupied. We worked like a well-oiled machine, or at least like two guys who were highly motivated by mischief. We loaded gnomes into wheelbarrows, wagons, and even an old laundry basket, ferrying them from my garage, across my lawn, and onto the newly christened Gnome Man's Land. The first gnome to officially take up residence was a particularly distinguished-looking fellow with a monocle and a tiny scroll, whom I dubbed Professor Norman. I placed him near the entrance path, as if to welcome visitors to this strange new world. Then came the others in a steady stream. We arranged the fishing gnomes around a small, dry depression I planned to eventually line and fill for a pond. The musical gnomes formed a little band near a cluster of ferns. A group of scholarly gnomes took up positions under the shade of the largest oak, complete with miniature books and spectacles. It was incredibly satisfying work. Each gnome placed felt like a tiny act of defiance, a small, colorful middle finger to the HOA's arbitrary tyranny. By lunchtime, the first wave was in position. Lot 7B was transformed. It was no longer just an overgrown vacant lot. It was a vibrant, whimsical, and undeniably gnome-filled landscape. From the street, it was now impossible to miss. A sea of pointy red hats, cheerful faces, and miniature tools greeted any passerby. Tom and I stood back, admiring our handiwork, sweaty but triumphant. "Think she'll notice?" Tom asked, grinning. "Oh, I'm counting on it," I replied. The waiting was the hardest part. I tried to go about my day normally, working from my home office, but my attention kept drifting to the window, my ears straining for any sign of commotion. It was around 3:30 p.m. when I saw her, Mrs. Periwinkle on her customary afternoon constitutional, strolling down the sidewalk. She was a creature of habit, her route as predictable as the setting sun. As she approached my property, then the adjacent Lot 7B, her pace visibly slowed. Her head, usually held high with an air of imperious authority, tilted slightly, like a confused bird. Then she stopped dead in her tracks. Her mouth, I could see even from my window, fell open. For a glorious 30 seconds, she just stood there, motionless, staring at the sudden, inexplicable explosion of gnomes. I wished I had a camera with a telephoto lens. Her expression must have been priceless, a cocktail of disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. Then she recovered. Her back stiffened, her mouth snapped shut into its customary thin line, and she marched, with renewed and furious purpose, straight towards my front door. The doorbell rang with an aggressive, insistent buzz. Here we go, I thought, taking a deep, steadying breath. Round 2. I opened the door to find Mrs. Periwinkle standing on my porch, her face flushed, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice tight with controlled fury. "What is the meaning of this infestation next door?" I feigned mild surprise. "Infestation, Mrs. Periwinkle? Are you referring to the charming garden gnomes I've placed on my new property?" Her eyes narrowed. "Your new property?" "Why, yes," I said with my most pleasant smile. "Lot 7B. I purchased it last month. Lovely little spot, don't you think? Perfect for a gnome sanctuary." The words "gnome sanctuary" seemed to physically pain her. "But you can't. It's an eyesore. It's right next to the subdivision. It affects all of us." "Well, Mrs. Periwinkle," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe, "as I'm sure you're aware, Lot 7B is not actually part of the subdivision. It's a separate parcel, not subject to our HOA's covenants or, if I may be so bold, its aesthetic judgments." I saw the flicker of understanding, and then deeper fury in her eyes as the implications of my statement sank in. She knew her CC and RS. She knew I was right. "This is an outrage," she sputtered. "It's a deliberate attempt to flout the rules and undermine this community." "Not at all," I said calmly. "It's simply a man enjoying his own private property, exercising his freedom to decorate it as he sees fit, much like I would have done on my original property, had I not been fined $500 for a few harmless gnomes. You might say you inspired me." Her face was now a fascinating shade of puce. She looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. "There will be consequences for this, Mr. Henderson. I will be looking into city ordinances. This is not over." And with that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering dire threats under her breath. I closed the door, a wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washing over me. The first salvo had been fired, and it had hit its mark perfectly. The gnomes of Lot 7B had made their debut, and Mrs. Periwinkle was officially on notice. The War of the Gnomes had well and truly begun. The aftermath of G-Day was everything I had hoped for and more. Mrs. Periwinkle, true to her word, did not take this lying down. The very next morning, I received another crisp, official-looking envelope. This one, however, wasn't a fine. It was a formal notice of concern from the HOA, CC'd to every member of the board, detailing their grave reservations about the unconventional landscaping on the adjacent property, Lot 7B. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucraties, full of phrases like potential negative impact on community harmony and aesthetic dissonance with established neighborhood character. It stopped short of making any actual demands or threats regarding Lot 7B directly, because, as I suspected, their legal counsel had probably informed them they had no jurisdiction. But it was a clear signal that they were not amused and would be watching my every move. I chuckled and filed it away with my growing collection of HOA correspondence. The gnomes, meanwhile, were causing quite a stir in the neighborhood. People on their morning walks would slow down, point, and whisper. Some looked confused, some disapproving. These were invariably Periwinkle loyalists. But many, to my delight, looked thoroughly amused. I saw smiles, even a few outright laughs. Kids, especially, were fascinated. I saw one little girl dragging her mother over, pointing excitedly at a gnome riding a snail. My nephew Tom reported that Gnome Man's Land was already becoming a hot topic among his friends. The legend was growing. My next step was to reinforce my position, literally. Over the following week, I continued to deploy more gnomes. The initial 200 were just the vanguard. I brought out the mining gnomes and set them up with tiny pickaxes and wheelbarrows around the rock pile, which I now dubbed the Periwinkle Peril Mine. The fishing gnomes got an upgrade. I bought a large, shallow plastic pond liner, dug it in, and filled it, creating a small but charming water feature. I even added a couple of floating decoy ducks for authenticity, though I suspected the gnomes would prefer to fish for something more exotic. The sunbathing gnomes beach was established with a bag of play sand and some miniature striped beach towels. I positioned them to catch the afternoon sun, complete with tiny sunglasses. Professor Norman was joined by a whole faculty of academic gnomes in the Philosopher's Grove. Each new addition was carefully placed, contributing to the overall narrative I was building. This wasn't just a random assortment of gnomes. It was a society, a thriving little civilization that just happened to be made of ceramic and resin. Mrs. Periwinkle's counteroffensive came in the form of increased scrutiny. I noticed her driving past my house, and Lot 7B, much more frequently than usual, her eyes scanning for any conceivable infraction. I made sure Lot 7B, while whimsical, was impeccably tidy.
Nostra trash, no overgrown hazards.
The gnomes might be unconventional, but they were clean and orderly rebels. Then came the anonymous complaints to the city. First, it was about unlicensed statuary. A call to the city planning department quickly confirmed that residential yard art, regardless of quantity, didn't require a license unless it constituted a structural hazard or a commercial enterprise. My gnomes were neither. Then, there was a complaint about potential vermin harborage due to the excessive ground cover, i.e., my gnomes and their charmingly rustic environment. A bored-looking city inspector came out, took one look at my well-maintained, if gnome-infested, lot, shrugged, and told me everything looked fine. He even chuckled at a gnome trying to climb a small sunflower. "Cute," he said before driving off, much to my satisfaction and, I imagined, Mrs. Periwinkle's apoplectic rage. Each failed attempt by the HOA to find a legitimate complaint only fueled my resolve and, it seemed, the amusement of the more open-minded neighbors. Sarah from across the street stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a cup of sugar, but really, I think, to get a closer look. "It's amazing," she said, eyes wide as she surveyed the burgeoning gnome metropolis. "My kids are obsessed. They've started naming them. Is that one? Is that one wearing a tiny kilt? That would be Hamish McTavish, chieftain of the Highland Gnome Regiment," I informed her solemnly. She burst out laughing. "You're completely mad, you know that? But I love it. Brenda Periwinkle must be having kittens. That's rather the point, isn't it?" I winked. The support, both overt and tacit, was heartening. Old Mr. Henderson gave me a thumbs up from his porch. Even the FedEx guy, Dave, started offering commentary on new arrivals. "Nice wizard gnome you got there today. Very Gandalf-esque." The gnome army was no longer just my private rebellion. It was becoming a neighborhood landmark, a symbol of humorous defiance. And it was still growing. I was well past 300 gnomes now, and still had boxes in the garage. The 7-foot inflatable gnome, which I named Norminator the Great, was yet to make his grand entrance. I was saving him for a special occasion. Mrs. Periwinkle and her board were clearly frustrated. Their usual tactics of fines and threats were useless against Lot 7B. They were learning, much to their chagrin, that the reach of an HOA, while often perceived as all-powerful by its residents, has very distinct and legally defined limits. And I was gleefully camped out just beyond those limits, with an ever-expanding army of smiling, pointy-hatted sentinels. The battle for Lot 7B was far from over, but the gnomes were digging in, and their numbers were swelling. The HOA, under the increasingly frantic leadership of Mrs. Periwinkle, wasn't about to concede defeat easily. If direct attacks on Lot 7B were proving fruitless, they would try indirect methods. Their next tactic was to attempt to rally the neighborhood against me, to paint me as a nuisance, a destabilizing force in their perfectly ordered universe. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The agenda item, cryptically worded, was discussion of community standards and neighboring property impacts. Everyone knew what that meant. It was the Gnome Summit, or more accurately, the Anti-Gnome Inquisition. I, of course, planned to attend. I wouldn't be speaking as the owner of Lot 7B, as they had no authority over it, but as a member of the HOA concerning my primary residence, and as an interested observer of their attempts to meddle where they had no business. The atmosphere in the community clubhouse that evening was tense. Mrs. Periwinkle sat at the head table, flanked by her stony-faced board members. The room was more crowded than usual. Clearly, the Gnome saga had captured the neighborhood's attention. Mrs. Periwinkle opened the meeting with a prepared speech, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed indignation. She spoke of preserving the character of our beautiful community, of maintaining property values, and the potential for undesirable elements to gain a foothold if vigilance is not maintained. She never mentioned me or Lot 7B by name, but the target was obvious. She then opened the floor for comments, clearly expecting a chorus of support from her allies. A few did speak up. Mrs. Higgins, a known periwinkle crony, clutched her pearls and lamented the tacky display that was visible from my kitchen window and, quite frankly, upsetting to my prize-winning poodles. Another resident, a retired military man who took HOA rules with the seriousness of the Geneva Convention, grumbled about lack of discipline and setting a bad precedent. But then, something unexpected happened. Sarah, from across the street, stood up. "Actually," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I rather like the gnomes. My children adore them. We make up stories about them. It's brought a bit of fun and whimsy to the neighborhood, which, frankly, has been a bit lacking lately." A murmur went through the room. Then old Mr. Henderson, leaning heavily on his cane, rose slowly. "Been living here 40 years, he rasped. "Seen a lot of changes. This HOA used to be about helping neighbors, keeping things safe. Now it seems to be about telling folks what color to paint their birdhouses and how many little fellas they can have in their garden. If a man wants to put some statues on his own land that isn't even part of this association, I say it's his business, not ours. Some folks need to find a real hobby." Another, louder murmur, this time with a few chuckles mixed in. Mrs. Periwinkle's face was a mask of fury. She tried to regain control, banging her gavel. "This is about standards," she insisted. "It's about protecting our investment. My investment in Lot 7B seems to be doing just fine, Mrs. Periwinkle," I said calmly from my seat, unable to resist. "In fact, it's bringing quite a bit of joy." It seems a few people snickered openly now. The meeting quickly devolved from there, not into the united front against me that Mrs. Periwinkle had envisioned, but into a broader debate about the HOA's heavy-handedness. Several other residents aired grievances about petty fines and overzealous enforcement of trivial rules. It turned out my gnomes were just the catalyst for a deeper discontent that had been simmering for months. The anti-Gnome Inquisition had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating me, it had exposed the cracks in Mrs. Periwinkle's authority and given voice to other frustrated homeowners. She adjourned the meeting abruptly, her face thunderous. I walked out feeling rather pleased. The gnomes weren't just fighting my battle. They were inadvertently fighting for a little more freedom and common sense for everyone. The HOA didn't give up, of course. Their next move was to scour city and county ordinances with a fine-toothed comb, looking for anything they could use. They tried to argue that my gnome display constituted an unpermitted sign due to its visibility, but since none of the gnomes were advertising anything, except perhaps the general concept of merriment, that went nowhere. They explored nuisance laws, but as Lot 7B was kept tidy, didn't generate noise or offensive odors, and wasn't attracting actual vermin, ceramic gnomes being notoriously poor hosts for rats, that too was a dead end. Each failed attempt seemed to chip away a little more at Mrs. Periwinkle's credibility. Meanwhile, the gnome population on Lot 7B continued its inexorable rise. I was now approaching the 400 mark. I'd started creating little vignettes. A gnome wedding party, complete with a tiny gnome bride and groom. A gnome construction crew working on a miniature and perpetually unfinished birdhouse. Even a slightly risque gnome spa hidden behind some bushes, featuring gnomes in tiny bathrobes. The local paper, a small community weekly, got wind of the story. A young, enthusiastic reporter named Brenda, ironically, called me for an interview. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to escalate things too much, but the idea of the gnomes getting their 15 minutes of fame was too amusing to pass up. I agreed on the condition that the article focused on the whimsical nature of the display and the positive community reactions, rather than just being an HOA bashing piece, though a little of that was inevitable. The article, when it came out, was titled No Man's Land. Local resident creates whimsical wonderland, sparks neighborhood debate. It featured a charming photo of me surrounded by a sea of gnomes, and quotes from Sarah and even a grudgingly neutral one from a city official who confirmed I wasn't breaking any laws. Mrs. Periwinkle, when contacted by the reporter, had apparently declined to comment, which spoke volumes. The article was a local sensation. Suddenly, Lot 7B wasn't just a neighborhood curiosity. It was a minor tourist attraction. People from neighboring towns started driving by slowly, cameras clicking. I even saw a car with out-of-state plates stop for a look. My gnomes had gone viral, at least on a very local scale. This, I knew, would infuriate Mrs. Periwinkle beyond measure. Her quest for pristine, anonymous conformity was being thwarted by an army of cheerful, brightly colored ceramic figures and a blaze of unwanted, folksy publicity. The pressure was mounting on her, not from me directly, but from the sheer, joyful absurdity of the situation I had created. And I still had my ace in the hole, Norminator the Great, the 7-foot inflatable gnome, waiting patiently in his box for the perfect moment to make his grand, towering debut. The local newspaper article was a turning point. It transformed my personal battle with the HOA into a public spectacle, and Mrs. Periwinkle did not appreciate being cast, however implicitly, as the villain in a quirky human interest story. Her attempts to quash the gnomes had only given them more prominence. She became even more reclusive and, according to neighborhood gossip, increasingly irate during HOA board meetings, which were now apparently dominated by the gnome problem. I decided it was time to press my advantage, to add a little more theatricality to the proceedings. The annual neighborhood summer block party was approaching. It was an HOA-sponsored event, usually a fairly staid affair with lukewarm hot dogs and forced mingling. This year, I had a different vision. I decided Lot 7B would host an unofficial Gnome Garden open house, concurrently with the block party. I put up a neatly lettered, hand-painted sign at the edge of my new property. "Welcome to Gnome Man's Land. Open for visitors. Prepare for whimsy." This, of course, was right next to the official HOA block party setup in the shared community green space. The juxtaposition was, I felt, rather delicious. On the morning of the block party, as the HOA volunteers were dutifully setting up their tables and stringing up limp balloons, I unveiled my piece de resistance, Norminator the Great. With the help of an electric air pump, the 7-foot inflatable gnome slowly rose to his full, magnificent height, right at the entrance to Lot 7B. He was glorious, bright red hat, bushy white beard, a cheerful, slightly vacant grin, and hands outstretched in a welcoming gesture. He towered over the official block party decorations, a benevolent, slightly goofy giant. Mrs. Periwinkle, who was overseeing the HOA setup with her usual grim efficiency, spotted Norminator inflating. I was too far away to hear what she said, but the stiffening of her posture and the way she stabbed a finger in his direction told me everything I needed to know. She was incandescent with rage. The effect on the block party attendees was immediate and profound. While some dutifully gravitated towards the HOA's hot dog stand, a significant number, especially families with children, were drawn like moths to a flame towards Lot 7B and its towering inflatable sentinel. My open house was an instant hit. I'd arranged the gnomes into even more elaborate scenes. The mining gnomes now had a crystal cave, made from some cleverly arranged rocks and fairy lights. The fishing gnomes had a tiny, hand-lettered sign saying, "Gone fishin'. No HOA members allowed, unless they bring worms." I'd even set up a gnome photo booth, with a few spare hats and beards for people to wear. Kids were squealing with delight, running along the paths, pointing out their favorite gnomes. Adults were chuckling, taking photos, and shaking their heads in amused disbelief. Sarah brought over a plate of cookies from the official party. "You've officially upstaged them," she whispered, grinning. Periwinkle looks like she's about to swallow her own gavel. Even some of the more reserved neighbors, people I barely knew, wandered over, drawn by the sheer spectacle. Many confessed they'd been secretly enjoying the gnomes from afar. The atmosphere on Lot 7B was joyful, a little chaotic, and utterly charming. It was everything the official HOA block party was not. Mrs. Periwinkle made one attempt to intervene. She marched over to the edge of Lot 7B, her face a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Henderson," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. This circus is disrupting the official neighborhood event." I ambled over, a picture of serene innocence. "Why, Mrs. Periwinkle, I'm just sharing my love of gnomes with the community. It's a private gathering on my private property. Surely you're not against community spirit." Her eyes darted around at the happy crowd on my lot, then back to the rather sparsely attended HOA tables. She knew she was beaten, at least for today. The public tide was clearly in favor of the Gnomes. "This is highly inappropriate," she hissed, before turning on her heel and retreating to the grim solitude of her official duties. The rest of the afternoon was a triumph for Gnomekind. My Gnome Garden open house was the undeniable center of attention. People brought their own lawn chairs and sat amongst the gnomes, chatting and laughing. Someone even started an impromptu Gnome-themed sing-along. By the time evening fell and Norminator the Great was gently deflated, to rest for future appearances, Lot 7B had cemented its place in neighborhood legend. It was more than just a collection of statues. It was a symbol of joyful rebellion, a testament to the fact that one person, armed with enough determination and a ridiculous number of garden gnomes, could indeed fight City Hall or at least a very stuffy HOA. The fallout from the block party was significant. Rumors began to circulate that several HOA board members, tired of Mrs. Periwinkle's increasingly erratic obsession with my gnomes and her declining popularity, were considering asking for her resignation. The Gnome Gambit had not only defended my right to quirky yard art but had also destabilized the very regime that had sought to suppress it. The power of the gnome was proving to be far greater than I, or indeed Mrs. Periwinkle, could ever have anticipated. The original $500 fine felt like a distant memory, a small price to pay for the sheer, unadulterated satisfaction of this victory. The weeks following the Gnome Garden open house marked a clear shift in the neighborhood dynamics. Mrs. Periwinkle became a much rarer sight. Her daily constitutional past my properties ceased altogether. When she was seen, she looked deflated, her usual ramrod posture somewhat slumped. The fire seemed to have gone out of her, replaced by a weary resignation. The HOA itself entered a period of quiet turmoil. Whispers grew louder about an internal power struggle. Several board members, who had perhaps only tolerated Mrs. Periwinkle's autocratic style when things were calm, were now openly questioning her leadership in the wake of the gnome debacle and the public relations disaster of the block party. My gnomes, all 507 of them, I'd done a final count, including Norminator, stood proudly on Lot 7B, a silent, smiling army that had won a significant victory without firing a single shot. Unless you counted the shots of pure joy they seemed to inspire in most onlookers. I made no moves to dismantle the display. Why would I? It had become a beloved local landmark. I did, however, ensure it remained tidy and well-maintained. The gnomes deserved a clean and orderly kingdom. Occasionally, I would add a new, particularly amusing gnome I'd found, or rearrange a scene to keep things fresh. It was my ongoing art project, my personal statement. The next official HOA communication I received was not another warning or notice of concern. It was an invitation to an extraordinary general meeting, the agenda, election of a new HOA president and review of community guidelines. My eyebrows shot up. This was it, the culmination. I attended the meeting, of course, taking a discreet seat at the back. Mrs. Periwinkle was there, but she didn't preside. She sat with the other residents, looking small and strangely ordinary without her usual aura of authority. The interim president, a mild-mannered accountant named Mr. Davies who had previously been the treasurer, announced that Mrs. Periwinkle had tendered her resignation from the presidency. Citing personal reasons, a wave of polite, almost inaudible sighs of relief swept through the room. The election for a new president was surprisingly swift. Sarah, from across the street, my first vocal supporter in the Gnome Wars, was nominated. To my delight, she accepted the nomination and, after a brief speech about fostering a more inclusive and less punitive community, was elected by a significant majority. The old guard was out. A new era was dawning for our beleaguered HOA. In the following months, under Sarah's much more reasonable leadership, many of the petty rules that Mrs. Periwinkle had instituted were quietly rolled back. The focus shifted from obsessive enforcement of aesthetic minutiae to genuine community building and maintenance of essential services. The HOA became less of an adversary and more of a benign, if still occasionally bureaucratic, presence. And what of the gnomes? Lot 7B, Gnome Man's Land, remained. It was too iconic to dismantle. Sarah, in her new capacity as HOA president, Even joked that they should put it on the official neighborhood map as a point of interest. The city never bothered me again. The gnomes had become an accepted, even cherished part of the local color. Occasionally, families would still stop by, and I'd see children pointing and laughing. It always brought a smile to my face. Looking back, the whole affair seems almost surreal. Did I really buy an entire plot of land just to win an argument about garden gnomes? Yes, I did. And I have no regrets. It cost a fair bit of money, true, but the peace of mind, the satisfaction of standing up to petty tyranny, and the sheer, unadulterated fun of it all were priceless. Taught me a few things. Firstly, know your rights and the limits of your adversary's authority. That CC&R document, as tedious as it was, held the key to my strategy. Secondly, sometimes the most effective form of protest is creative, humorous, and utterly unexpected. Mrs. Periwinkle was prepared for angry letters and legal arguments. She was not prepared for a relentless, joyful invasion of several hundred garden gnomes. And finally, it showed me that even in seemingly mundane suburban settings, there's always room for a little bit of magic, a little bit of rebellion, and a whole lot of whimsy. My gnomes aren't just ceramic figures anymore. They're a testament to that. They're symbols of freedom, individuality, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you fought the good fight, even if your weapons were pointy hats and painted-on smiles. Every now and then, I walk through Lot 7B, checking on Professor Norman, ensuring Hamish McTavish's kilt is straight, and giving Norminator the Great, who now makes seasonal appearances, an appreciative pat. And I think, for $500, they wanted to take away my little patch of joy. Instead, they inspired me to create a whole new world. And that, my friends, is what I call a bargain. So, if your HOA is giving you grief, remember my story. Maybe you don't need to buy the lot next door, but don't let them extinguish your spark. Find your own gnomes, whatever they may be, and let them shine.